We're going to be deploying an application to two groups of to two cluster groups. Not the cluster that we created in the first part, but we have a separate set of two cluster groups. We're going to create subscriptions for two versions of our demo application and show how to manage the deployment of those apps. We're going to have a link for this later on, but the application being used is this example microservice-based Kafka application that uses a managed Kafka service in Confluent, but runs a set of microservices in OpenShift to manage a queue and service requests from a Node UI. This will make it easy to kind of see the differences between different versions as we deploy them into the cluster groups. So Anthony, do you want to take the next part and show the configurations intro?
Yeah, thanks, Jan. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And yeah, is my screen up? Yep. Yeah, so like what Dave and Jan mentioned, satellite configuration, it allows you to specify what Kubernetes resources you want to deploy in your group of Red Hat OpenShift clusters that run in your satellite location or even in IBM Cloud. So for the key components of satellite configuration, we have versions, subscriptions, and cluster groups. So a cluster group, it specifies a set of OpenShift clusters that are registered with the satellite config component and that are included in the satellite configuration. And with cluster group, you can also add manually the IBM Cloud OpenShift clusters that you currently have that's outside of your satellite location. And a version represents a Kubernetes resource YAML file that you uploaded or manually created for the satellite configuration. And subscription, it is created so that you can subscribe your cluster group to a version. So a subscription, it contains a version and a cluster group. And yeah, so Jan already went through this. And so for the demo, let me show you how you create a cluster group. So for creating a cluster group, it's easy. It's just go to cluster groups and you create a cluster group, and let's name it test cluster group and create. And you click on the cluster group, then you can add as many clusters as you want. So grouping your clusters, it depends on how you want to group them. So for example, in our demo, let me share a video. Let me pull that video up. So in this demo, we have 4 clusters. And in these 4 clusters, we group them into 2. So we have application A dev cluster group. We're using this for our dev environment. And we have 2 clusters in them, Anthony Amanse 4.5 and 4.6. And another one named application A staging. And we have the 2 clusters in a satellite location, example bank satellite and Anthony satellite. And to create a configuration, we just click on create configuration, and we're naming it application A for this example. And we click on that one, and like we mentioned, a version, it's just a YAML file. It's the definition for your Kubernetes resources. and let's name it application A front end v1. So in this demo, we're specifying one version for a microservice, and let's go ahead and add our YAML file. So in this YAML file, we have a deployment called example food that contains our resource. And this annotation here, it's the, if you take a look at the label, RASI watch resource detail, that allows you to monitor this resource in your satellite configuration. And the container image, it's using an example front end with the tag of v1. So it's our version 1 of our application. And we also have a service and a route to expose this example application. And let's go ahead and add that one. So now we have a version. Now we create a subscription, and we're naming this subscription application a front end on dev clusters. So for this subscription, it's just we're using a front end v1 that points to our dev cluster group. And when we create that cluster, that subscription, let's take a look at our OpenShift console for our first cluster in our dev cluster group. And let's take a look at our deployment. You can see it's now deployed and our pod is now running, and it was created a few seconds ago. That means it was created by the subscription. And let's take a look at the route. So this is our sample application. And if you take a look, the front end, we have some mobile simulator and some sliders. And the graph below, it's the number of orders and fulfillment. And let's take a second look at the second cluster. We'll see the same thing. We should see the same thing. And let's take a look at the pods. It was created less than a minute ago. And let's check the route. And yeah, it's the same v1 application. We have the graph there that shows the orders and fulfilled orders. And now our next step should be creating another subscription for our staging cluster group, naming it application A front end on staging clusters. And we're selecting the front end v1 version, and we're selecting the staging cluster group. So instead of selecting the dev clusters, we're now using staging cluster group. So now let's go to the OpenShift console on the first cluster of the cluster group, which is named Anthony Satellite. And let's take a look at the deployment. So this is the deployment example food. Take a look at the pods. It was created a few seconds ago. Now it's running. We can check the route to access our sample application. We see the same thing. Since we're using the same image, it makes sense to see the same thing. Now let's take a look at the example bank satellite, which is the second cluster in our second cluster group. We'll see that the pod is also running. It was created less than a minute ago. Should check the route. So now we see that everything's working. Our next step would be creating a new version. So for creating a new version, you can either create a new one or you can duplicate this application front end v1, and we can just modify the v2. We're duplicating this one because we're just gonna modify one thing, which is the container image name. So we're also adding a description here called dark mode, since our v2 is about implementing a dark mode in our example application. And we're modifying the container image to a new tag, which is v2. And yeah, so before this recording, we already built and pushed this container image, so we don't need to do that. Now we have a new version. So to apply this version, all you need to do is go through the subscription, and you just do is edit this subscription and replace that version with the version application A front-end v1 to use the new version that you just created, application A front-end v2. Now, if we take a look at our OpenShift console and take a look at the deployments, we should see, yep, one is running, one is container creating. So the new one is actually being created and it's now running, and the old one is actually terminated. So now the update is a success. Let's take a look at the OpenShift route. Now we'll see the new design of our example front end. And yeah, we'll see that this graph is a lot smoother. We have some dark mode implemented, and let's take a look at the other dev cluster and take a look at the pods. Should also show that the pod is new, and let's take a look at the route, and we should see the same thing. Now, the next step would be like updating our application on our staging clusters. So let's modify that subscription, and we'll do the same thing. We're gonna select the version, which is the application A front-end v2, and we just save that one. And if we take a look at the OpenShift console of the Anthony Satellite cluster, which is our staging, one of our staging clusters, let's take a look at the pod. See that one is pending. That means it's being created. So the speed, it depends on the size of your container image. This one's fairly lightweight, so it only took a few seconds. And here is the application route. We access that, and we should see the same thing as before from our dev clusters. And yeah, we're going to take a look at the example bank satellite console, and we should see the same thing in our deployments. We should see, yeah, one pod is terminating, one pod is running, which is the updated one. And let's take a look at the application, and yeah, this one's the same thing. And yeah, there you have it. And let me go back to my slides. So a quick recap of what we did. My slides are on. So yeah, so the first iteration we did is we created a front-end v1 version, which contains our YAML of the K8s resources, which were the services, deployments, and routes. And in our subscription, we created a subscription A with the version that we just created, and it's pointing to our dev cluster group. And since we created that subscription, our clusters in our dev cluster group should pick that one up, and it should deploy our v1 resources. And the next step we did was create another subscription for our staging cluster group, which contains the same version, the v1, and our staging cluster group should pick that one up and deploy the same resources. And our third iteration, we did create a new version, the v2, which only has one minimum change, which is the container image. And we also modified our subscription, our first subscription, to use that new version that points to our dev cluster group. And when you modify that version, your clusters in your dev cluster group should pick that one up and update the resources that this version is defining. And for our last iteration, we edited the subscription, the second subscription, and we used the front-end v2, which is this one, which is the dark mode that we just showed. And our staging cluster group should also pick that one up and update the defined resources. And so in practice, what you could be doing is not doing them manually in the console, although you can do that, but you can also implement them in your own CI/CD pipelines. Argo CD is one of the popular ones. Jenkins used to be the popular one. And Travis CI if you want something simple, GitLab CI/CD. And to integrate this, you can use the satellite configuration CLI. So what you can do is use these commands, IBM Cloud Sat config version to create a new version, sat subscription to create and manage new and old subscriptions. And to see more commands, you can also do IBM Cloud Sat. And yeah, so you can use all these commands to automate them yourselves. And for resources, we'll post this one in our chat. So for CLI reference docs, you can visit that link. And for configuration documents, you can also visit the IBM Cloud documentations. And the last link is about the code pattern, about scaling microservices integrated with Kafka using Kata. So in this demo, we only showed the front end. So yeah, if you like that UI, feel free to check this code pattern out. And with that said, I'll hand it over to Jan, and he'll demo the satellite link endpoints.